Historically, the United States of America is known as a beacon of hope, liberty, happiness, and independence for all who choose to pursue it, except for one particular group. We are going to take a look at 10 black towns that once staked their claim for independence and self-sufficiency, but was thwarted by predatory policies, economic strangulation, and horrific acts of violence, including the only bombing to ever take place on American soil. Number 10. Wilmington, North Carolina, 1898. January 6, 2021. More than 2,000 angry and violent citizens protested the results of the 2020 presidential election by turning their ire towards the epicenter of the United States, the U.S. Capitol building. That day resulted in the death of 5 people, and 174 police officers were injured, but the insurrection was thwarted.
I take full responsibility. It's not my fault that he came here.
That violent coup wasn't successful, but in 1898, it was. Almost 30 years after the end of the Civil War that put whites and blacks on the front lines against each other, Wilmington, North Carolina stood as an early example of what could happen if they worked together. The Republican Party of Wilmington consisted of black aldermen, elected auditors and financiers, deputy clerks, superintendents. Even Republican President William McKinley named a black man, John C. Dancy, the U.S. Collector of Customs at the Port of Wilmington. During this time, the Democratic Party was the home of white supremacist ideals. It was also home of the terrorist organization Ku Klux Klan and the paramilitary group the Red Shirts. As the resentment of black progress among the Democratic ballooned, more equity shifted. After losing the election of 1896, the Democratic Party spent the next 2 years with one goal in mind: destroy black affluence. Their weapon of choice, the media. Democrats used local newspapers to run articles of divisiveness and stoke the fear of black dominance. It started by claiming blacks would take economic control by depriving its white counterparts of work, even though blacks were the minority in the workforce by a substantial margin. The claims became even more sinister and salacious. Articles and cartoon depictions began to circulate, insinuating black power meant putting white women in danger. When voting days finally came, to ensure victory, the paramilitary arm of the Democrats were sent to booths to ensure no black people would even get a say who would be in office. The Democrats won by a landslide, claiming every available position up for election. But the mission was not to eliminate blacks in power, it was to eliminate black affluence. The Democrats declared the White Declaration of Independence. We will no longer be ruled or ever ruled again by men of African origin. The Declaration aimed to strip black men of all voting rights, replace every prominent position held by a black man with a white man, and strip any other economic foothold African Americans held in the state. The next morning, hundreds of armed white men set fire to the Daily Record, the only black-owned newspaper in Wilmington. Later, armed white men gathered at City Hall and intimidated every remaining Republican official into resigning. All vacated positions were then replaced by newly elected Democrats. By nightfall, 2,000 armed, angry white men gathered to finish the mission. Upwards to 100 black residents were killed, while others hid out in the neighboring swamp and cemetery. Thousands of African Americans escaped, never to return to Wilmington again. This marked the first and only successful insurrection in America's history. Our next 2 examinations of black towns take us out west. Number 9. Santa Monica, California. The Great Migration of African Americans leaving the South to escape Jim Crow segregation usually talks about them migrating to the East Coast and Midwest, but some escaped to the Golden State, California. The city of Santa Monica is the first African American settlement to be a seaside community. Lured by employment opportunities, beautiful landscapes, and great weather, Southern California in general became a popular destination for those seeking a better life. But the black neighborhoods in Santa Monica helped establish the beach community as we know it today. Between the 1920s and 1970s, African Americans established themselves as mainstays within the city. They taught themselves how to surf, established themselves as entrepreneurs and community leaders, and brought with them jazz music. However, they may have escaped Jim Crow segregation, but they didn't escape overt racism. Today, California is known as a place of liberation, a place where dreams come true and you can be whoever you want to be. But that was not the case for African Americans during the 20th century. As more and more migrants made their way into Santa Monica, elected officials created policies that denied them access to the city's resources. In 1922, Santa Monica created its first zoning ordinance, an adoption that denied building permits to a group of wealthy African Americans looking to establish a bathhouse. They even extended the ordinance to shut down a popular black-owned jazz club. Zoning ordinances coupled with racist real estate covenants kept black people locked into one section of Santa Monica, the Pico Corridor. Outside of Pico, black residents could not operate business, nor rent or own housing. The segregation in Santa Monica even extended to the beach. What was known as the Caucasian Clause prevented the leasing, sale, or occupation of oceanfront properties to African Americans. This clause protected sections of Santa Monica's public beaches from black visitors. The segregation of the beaches only allowed black beachgoers to enjoy a section of the beach known as the Inkwell. The discriminatory housing policies and political crimes against black people crescendoed into the 1950s and 60s with urban development. The Pico neighborhood was split in half with the development of the Interstate 10 freeway. It drove a stake through the heart of the black community, making it an undesirable place to live, displacing half the residents and destroying local businesses. At number 8, Allensworth, California. Just 2 hours north from Los Angeles, Allensworth, California, is the oldest black town in California's history. Colonel Allen Allensworth, a born slave, rose to prominence as the highest-ranking black officer of his time. After his retirement in 1906, Allensworth and a fellow comrade, William A. Payne, helped establish the California Colony and Home Promoting Association. Inspired by Booker T. Washington's message of economic self-sufficiency, the association purchased 20 acres of land with the sole intention of establishing a town for black soldiers, where they could control their own destiny. By 1910, Colonel Allensworth had officially established the land as Allensworth. The municipality was perfectly placed between Los Angeles and San Francisco. African Americans started farms devoted to sugar, wheat, barley, and cotton. Allensworth benefited greatly from an adjacent stop of the Santa Fe Railroad. Because of that, many travelers were able to purchase goods and services from the businesses of the town. For several years, Allensworth was a utopian community for African Americans looking to escape the ills of racism and segregation, a place where they could truly control their own destiny. Allensworth became home to California's first African American school district. It also had its own courthouse, hotel, and library. But the utopia was short-lived. In 1914, Colonel Allensworth died. He was struck by a motorcycle while crossing the street. Without the guidance of their leader, Allensworth couldn't withstand the onslaught of what came next. In a profound act of economic punishment, the Santa Fe Railroad Company diverted trains away from Allensworth, building a new stop in a neighboring town. The town then experienced a devastating drought. Originally, a deal had been made with the Pacific Farming Company to build enough wells. The farming company reneged on the deal, and without enough capital and other resources needed to drill their own wells, Allensworth agricultural suffered. By 1920, the utopian dream was another American nightmare for the residents of Allensworth. Our next black town was so famous that they made a movie inspired by it. Nestling at number 7, Rosewood, Florida, 1923. Rosewood, Florida is just 2 hours south of the state's capital, a small town that initially attracted both black and white people. But by the turn of the century, as jobs and resources left, so did its white settlers. By the early 1920s, Rosewood had become a small haven for black people in the Jim Crow South. 2 black families sat at the head of Rosewood, the Goins and the Carriers. The community became so tight-knit that at one point everyone was somehow related to one another. The black residents of Rosewood couldn't vote because of segregation laws, but they still thrived as a community. There were several churches, a sugarcane mill, a school, and they even had their own baseball team, the Rosewood Stars. They even had 2 convenience stores, including John Wright's General Store, which was white-owned. By all accounts, the relationship between the black residents of Rosewood and their neighboring white counterparts was amicable until 1923. It was New Year's Day when everything fell to absolute pieces. Fannie Taylor was a white young married mother who lived just across the street in nearby Sumner. Her husband was away at work when neighbors responded to hearing screams coming from the Taylor home. Fannie was found beaten and assaulted, and her alleged assailant, a black man. The county sheriff assembled a posse to launch an immediate investigation, deputizing as many as 400 volunteers to search for the assailant who allegedly made his way into Rosewood. First, a mob of 150 men arrived at the home of Aaron Carrier. Reports say he was pulled from his home, tied to the back of a car, and dragged to the police station. The next victim was Sam Carter, a local worker at the turpentine mill. He was tortured, mutilated, and executed. His body hung as a warning to anyone who could be housing the alleged fugitive. However, the people of Rosewood would not be intimidated. For the next several days, the residents of Rosewood defended their homestead. Led by Sarah and Sylvester Carrier, they exchanged shots with incoming vigilantes who tried to intrude on their property. Others ran for safety, hiding away the children in nearby swamps. As the battle raged on, newspapers reported the event as a race war, encouraging others from all over to bear down on the small town. In the end, the Carriers were overwhelmed. Eyewitnesses claim 150 black people were killed, most of them unarmed. Those white travelers who missed out on the shootout razed what was left of Rosewood by setting fire to every school, church, and place of business, except John Wright's general store. Have you heard about any of these historical black towns before? Comment below. This next community on our list were the recipients of the only airplane bombing to take place on American soil. At number 6, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1985. The Liberty Bell is an iconic symbol of independence and is located just 17 minutes east of one of the worst attacks on people seeking their own independence. MOVE was founded in 1972 in Philadelphia by John Africa. Their unique philosophy blended nature laws, anarcho-primitivism, and advocacy for animal rights. Every member of MOVE took on the last name Africa as dedication to their mother continent and adopted a Rastafarian tradition of allowing their hair to dreadlock. The community believed in the rights of all living things, often conducting nonviolent protests against the mistreatment of animals in the form of puppy mills, zoos, and circuses, and the mistreatment of people in the wake of the 3 Mile Island, industrial pollution, and police brutality. The group became known as part Black Power and part Flower Power. However, their opposition to fully participating in the societal norms of city living didn't go over well with neighbors, local politicians, or the Philadelphia Police Department. After a series of complaints from their neighbors, the Philadelphia Police Department obtained a court order to force MOVE to evacuate their current dwellings and surrender all weapons. In August of 1978, the Philadelphia police and members of MOVE engaged in their first deadly altercation. In the end, 1 police officer was gunned down. As a result, 9 members of MOVE were convicted, each sentenced to 100 years apiece. By 1985, the people of MOVE had reestablished themselves in a row home on Osage Avenue. The group continued their hunter-gatherer lifestyle, homeschooling, and composting, much to the dismay of their neighbors. This time, Philly's first black mayor, Wilson Goode, gave the order to evict MOVE. Sadly, this time was even more deadly. Not for the police, though. This time, the people of MOVE were met by the full force of the Philadelphia police. Thousands and thousands of rounds of bullets were fired into the row house. The people of MOVE were overwhelmed as they tried to protect the women and children huddled inside. Then, in an act never seen before or since, the unthinkable happened. A C-4 bomb was dropped from a Philadelphia police helicopter. The bomb completely leveled the home and left 2 blocks worth of devastation. In total, 6 adults and 5 children of MOVE were killed. They were the victims of the only sanctioned bombing on American soil. Number 5. Overtown, Miami, Florida. When oil and rail tycoon Henry Flagler needed a place for his black construction workers to live, the city of Miami designated a small district right outside of downtown. This part of Miami became known as Colored Town and later named Overtown. In the separate but equal Jim Crow South, Overtown became a haven for black people. It was home to South Florida's first high school designated for African Americans, and home to one of America's first black millionaires, D.A. Dorsey. During the 1940s, Overtown was named the Little Broadway of the South. It became a refuge for black mainstream entertainers who would perform at classic white establishments like the Fontainebleau and Eden Broche, but were not allowed to lodge there. On any given night, you could catch Billie Holiday, Jackie Robinson, Nat King Cole, or Joe Louis strolling through Overtown. However, Overtown would become a victim of economic deprivation. As the city of Miami grew, they built highways and an expressway over the town. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave way to other places for African Americans to take their homes, commerce, and businesses. At its peak, Overtown was a thriving hub of roughly 50,000, but by the 1980s, it became economically destitute and home to only 10,000. Our next black town isn't as well known as what replaced it. Number 4, Seneca Village, New York. Central Park, one of the most famous parks in the world, the home of runners, family picnics, and countless famous movie scenes. A must-see for people visiting New York. But did you know Central Park was once the home of a black town? Seneca Village was founded in 1825 by free black Americans. In 1 week, a 25-year-old African American named Andrew Williams and members of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church purchased in total 21 lots from the previous owner, a white farmer. After slavery was abolished in New York State, Seneca Village welcomed more immigrants. Later, the Great Famine of Ireland brought in a new marginalized group, the Irish. Despite their cultural differences and social conflicts, the Irish and blacks lived alongside each other in the village. At its peak, Seneca Village was a bustling community of middle-class blacks and working-class Irishmen, 3 churches, 2 schools, 2 cemeteries, and almost 400 people. At the time, it was one of the only places African Americans could buy land and exist free of harassment and discrimination. However, black prosperity would not last long. In 1857, the government of New York State enacted eminent domain, a practice in which private property is seized in order to create land for public use. Seneca Village thus became Central Park. We're getting into our top 3, and believe me, you'll want to smash that subscribe button for more. Now, let's move on to number 3. At number 3, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., the capital city of America and the most powerful city in the world, but at one point, it was known as the Chocolate City. As the South continued to enact stricter laws and segregation practices, many blacks migrated north as part of the Great Migration, in search of better education, job opportunities, and a way to escape legal lynchings. The capital became a popular landing place. In D.C., African Americans thrived, establishing several neighborhoods, a myriad of thriving businesses, and established the first black high school in America, Paul Laurence Dunbar Senior High School. They even had their own baseball team, the Homestead Grays of the Negro League. D.C. established itself as a place where black politicians, entertainers, and activists could all gather. By 1950, with 35% of its residents identifying as black, a white exodus to the suburbs of Northern Virginia and Southern Maryland began. Less than a decade later, Washington, D.C. was declared the first major American city to be majoritively black. For years, the black citizens of D.C. continued to build and expand. Out of it came historical destinations like the U Street District, the mighty Howard University, thriving enclaves, museums, and schools. The black Washingtonians even created their own Grammy Award-winning music genre, go-go. But in the heart of politics, the Chocolate City would be melted down. Decades of policies that impacted black residents, including excluding job opportunities, unfair wage practices, and deceitful housing and banking tactics. Years of turmoil and chaos brought on by the war on drugs left many black residents dead and imprisoned, leading to fractured homes and decimated neighborhoods. The final nail in the coffin came with urban renewal plans during the early millennium. It enticed those who fled to the suburbs to come back to the city. Eventually, historically black neighborhoods were overtaken by gentrification, leading to an exodus of black people who had been priced out. In 2020, for the first time in almost 70 years, black residents no longer were the majority. Number 2, Harlem, New York. Nothing epitomized the combination of black affluence and art like Harlem during the early 20th century. Fueled by not only the great migration of blacks from the South, but Harlem welcomed immigrants from the West Indies. This mixture of black cultures created a stew of new fashion trends, music, and art, and eventually became known in the history books as the Harlem Renaissance. Harlem was unique in the sense it didn't hide or steer clear of white America. Instead, it influenced America and the world. Harlem controlled its own narrative as they housed their own publishing houses, newspapers, and music companies. Their nightclubs, playhouses, and cabarets were solicited by celebrities, socialites, and dignitaries from all over the world. Harlem represented an overt racial pride in what many deemed the new Negro. African Americans like Duke Ellington, Josephine Baker, Zora Neale Hurston, and Langston Hughes finally had a place to proudly produce their own art, music, and literature, and be seen as intellectual. They showcased their ability to rock furs, jewels, dance the night away, and still fight against pervading racism, promote socialist politics, all with a spirit of self-determination. The neighborhood was also home to black activism. Marcus Garvey lived and launched his Back to Africa movement in Harlem. Later, Harlem became a hub during the civil rights movements and the home of black nationalist groups. Famously, the Nation of Islam's Temple No. 7, which was run by Malcolm X. At its pinnacle, Harlem was a stage. It was its own planet, from the way people dressed to the way they talked. Even with all their influence, the black residents of Harlem didn't own Harlem. Clubs, businesses, and homes were privately owned by landlords who often overcharged their black tenants. Because of predatory practices throughout New York City, Harlem was flooded with black residents who couldn't get housing anywhere else, and slumlords took advantage. Desperate working-class black renters were often charged 200% more than white renters. The same practices that allowed these slumlords to charge more also allowed them to do less, and lots of buildings in Harlem fell into despair. By the end of the Civil Rights Movement, less than half of the housing in Harlem was considered safe. Our next black town has become the standard of black enterprise, and an unfortunate example of the measures people will take to stomp out black excellence. Sitting up at number 1, Greenwood, Oklahoma, 1921. Nothing is more synonymous with black cohesiveness and self-determination than these words: Black Wall Street. At the birth of a new century, many African Americans made their way toward Oklahoma. It was a land grab that attracted many black people with the hopes of building a firewall between them and Jim Crow segregation. A small section of Tulsa, Oklahoma became known as Little Africa, and is where the seeds of black industry were planted. Word of this burgeoning black town made its way to Booker T. Washington, who visited in 1905. He was impressed with what he saw. Mr. Washington encouraged them to focus on growth, continued to cooperate among themselves, and encouraged them to expand their enterprise into a 4,000-acre strip. Under the guidance of Booker T. Washington, that 4,000-acre strip became Greenwood Avenue. Greenwood Avenue would be the home of black-owned grocery stores, retail shops, libraries, and even banks. Greenwood Avenue would be known forever as Black Wall Street. Black Wall Street became a bustling district that attracted black doctors, lawyers, and entrepreneurs. Black families who came to Tulsa just looking for an opportunity turned their desperation into wealth. Some bought land and developed on it. Entrepreneurs like J.B. Stratford and O.W. Gurley opened their own hotel, while others opened barbershops and churches. But as we've seen thus far, when black prosperity and independence flourish on one side, resentment and jealousy burns hotter on the other. At its pinnacle, Black Wall Street was home to 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, numerous nightclubs and churches, and most of Tulsa's 10,000 black residents lived there. They established solidarity by electing their own leadership, and most importantly, they funded their own economic growth. On May 30th, 1921, a young black shoe shiner entered an elevator operated by a young white woman. The stories of what actually happened during that moment are conflicting, but what happened as a result is not. Here are the facts. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, walked on an elevator operated by a young white 17-year-old woman named Sarah Page. Allegedly, someone heard a scream and found Sarah in a distraught state. However, news headlines the next day claimed a black man had sexually assaulted a white woman, and for that charge, that meant imminent death for Dick Rowland. In order to protect him, police placed the young man in protective custody on the top floor of the police station. As rumors of what happened between Dick Rowland and Sarah Page spread, mobs of vengeful white men descended on the police station, demanding the police chief turn over Rowland in order to be taught a lesson. The black residents of Tulsa also got word of the incoming threats, and in response, they too went to the police station to defend against a potential takeover. And that is when the gunpowder finally ignited. A white man demanded an armed black man hand over his firearm. He refused. A tussle ensued, and one shot rang off, leaving the white man wounded. In retaliation, the mob retrieved their own weapons while others ransacked local businesses in search of weapons. The mob had swelled to 2,000 white men, mostly armed, and were met by a few dozen armed black men. The first battle began on the outskirts of Greenwood District and left 10 white men and 2 black men gunned down. The firefight raged on through the night, consequently spilling over onto Black Wall Street. This prompted some residents to take up arms, others to hide and flee. The angry mob began to set fires to property as they looted and destroyed local black-owned businesses. Tulsa fire trucks showed up, but were threatened if they helped put out any of the blazes. They retreated, and the fires engulfed the district. As the bullets rang out, an attack from above came down. Dozens of planes carrying assailants and firebombs flew over, causing even more death and structural damage. It took days for the smoke to clear. In the end, upwards 200 dead black bodies were recovered. Black Wall Street reduced to ashes. America, 1731. The country's greatest commodity is unpaid labor in the form of chattel slavery, reserved solely for those of darker skin. But in a small corner of Maryland, a story's brewing that'll rewrite the rules. It's the tale of Benjamin Banneker, a man who defied expectations with groundbreaking science, astronomical feats, and even helped design the most powerful city in the world. His story actually starts on the windswept shores of England in 1683. There stood Molly Welsh, faced with an impossible choice. See, Molly was accused of stealing milk, a crime then punishable by death. However, as fate would have it, England at the time was having trouble populating their new American colonies. And even though Molly was poor, she was literate. The English couldn't really afford to execute an educated woman capable of childbearing, so Molly was given a choice: 7 years of indentured servitude in a distant land or death. She chose servitude. Though brutal, it offered a flicker of hope and a path to eventual freedom. Reaching American soil, Molly's choice landed her on a tobacco farm in Baltimore County, Maryland. After 7 years of toiling and sweating in the fields, Molly was granted her freedom and was ready to carve out her own path in the land of opportunity. So even though she was able to secure 50 acres of tobacco farmland, she too needed to take advantage of America's greatest commodity at that time: slavery. The solitary endeavor of managing a vast tobacco farm proved daunting for any lone soul. That remained one of the most echoed excuses for proponents of slavery. But Molly's choice to go from servant to master would cast a nuanced shadow over her family for generations to come. Needing labor to work her farm, Molly ventured to the docks. Imagine a modern-day fish market, but instead of crab, snapper, or lobster, men, women, and children shipped straight from the west coast of Africa. She purchased 2 men that day. Among them was Beneke, a man of dignity and intelligence, who was once a prince among the Dogon people of West Africa. On the farm, despite the complexities, a bond formed between Molly and Beneke, so much so that Molly eventually freed the other slave and married Beneke, even taking his name, becoming Molly Welsh Beneke. Their relationship transcended the master-slave dynamic, defying societal norms and laws. Now you see, to marry a slave was illegal, and so was interracial marriages. Over time, Molly and Beneke forged a bond molded by resiliency and patched together with love, leading to several children, including Mary Beneke, Benjamin's mother. Together, they raised their children with values of self-reliance, compassion, and a keen awareness of the injustices surrounding them. The apple didn't fall very far from the tree in Mary's case. She too would risk her freedom to marry a former slave. Robert, who was taken from his native land in Guinea, earned his freedom 7 years prior to finding a kindred spirit in Mary. Once married, he too adopted the last name Beneke. Their union stood as a testament to their courage and a bold act of defiance against racial prejudice. This defiance would become a beacon for their son, Benjamin, inspiring him to challenge injustices and forge his own path towards greatness. Can you name a time where you chose love against all odds? Comment below. Farming was the business of Beneke. It also became the young Benjamin's classroom. His mother, Mary, shared the wisdom passed down from generations, teaching him the rhythms of planting, nurturing crops, and the art of taming the soil. With each passing season, Benjamin learned the secrets of successful farming, fostering a deep bond with the earth and its cycles. Off the field, his father, Robert, encouraged him to think outside the box. This led young Benjamin to tinker with scraps found around the land. This mixture of agriculture as a family business and ingenuity in the blood was nurtured and cultivated by both his parents and would become the bedrock of his meteoric rise through history. This unique blend of defiance, curiosity, and ingenuity timed up perfectly the day Joseph Levi made his way onto the family's farm. During this time, it was rare to see a clock. A great number of people used the position of the sun to determine lunchtime. Joseph Levi was a distinguished Englishman who sported a curious contraption dangling from his jacket, a pocket watch. Mesmerized, Benjamin, who was now 22 years old, convinced Joseph to lend it to him. Most farmers would simply admire the rarity of a pocket watch, but Benjamin wanted to dissect it. Joseph lent the watch to Benjamin with the intention of collecting it once he returned from a voyage to England. Unfortunately, Joseph died at sea. Fate fell on the side of the Benekes once again. Benjamin took the watch apart, sketched it, and figured out exactly how it worked. He then took some hardwood and began carving out copies of the watch's parts. Clocks were rare in the 1700s. By the time Benjamin was done, he had designed the first clock ever made in America. This mostly self-taught farm boy made history with a hobby. Speaking of time, take a second to click those subscribe and like buttons. Now let's get back to this amazing story. Developing innovative ways to yield crops and creating America's first clock are typically footnotes compared to his next feat. We have to get off the farm and travel 40 miles south to what was to become the most powerful city in the world, now known as Benjamin Banneker because it was easier to pronounce. His astronomical knowledge caught the attention of those building the new capital city. The land surveying team sought a man that could read the stars like a map. And this is where friend of the family Fate came to visit again. Several years before the survey, the Ellicott brothers Andrew, John, and Joseph became neighbors of the Banneker's farm. They were Quakers, and because of their religion, held similar sensibilities on race as Benjamin. The Ellicotts became friendly with Benjamin, loaning him books on astronomy, and just like everything else he got his hands on, Benjamin not only returned the books but also gave back his findings on how to calculate solar eclipses. Fast forward, and what do you know? Who was hired to assemble a team of surveyors for America's soon-to-be capital city? Yep, the Ellicotts. They immediately brought on Benjamin for astronomical observations and base point calculations. Using his calculations, he helped plot the streets, avenues, and very bones of the city, embedding his legacy within its design. Benjamin Banneker was a master of mathematics, crafting almanacs that predicted weather patterns, guided farmers planting cycles, and even aided sailors navigating the seas. He was the LeBron James of geniuses of his time. He was also very in tune with who he was and how he was perceived, as a free black man during a time where most black people in the country were in chains. In a time of stark inequality, Benjamin dared to challenge the most powerful man in the nation, President Thomas Jefferson. In a letter that echoed through history, he questioned the hypocrisy of a nation founded on liberty while enslaving its own people. His words pierced the conscience of a nation, sparking debates about equality and humanity. Benjamin Banneker's legacy is not merely a story of individual brilliance. It's a testament to the enduring power of resilience, of carving paths where none existed, and challenging injustice with intellect and unwavering conviction. His life illuminates the enduring truth that even amidst darkness, the human spirit can ignite, casting light upon a brighter future. May we always remember his legacy and strive to embody the courage and brilliance he exemplified.
The Harlem Renaissance, a cultural awakening. The Black experience in America has been an odyssey of tragedy, triumph, defeat, and discovery, but nothing was as impactful as the Harlem Renaissance. This video will cover how the Harlem Renaissance redefined not only Black culture, but how it impacted the world. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. The Harlem Renaissance stands as a beacon of artistic and intellectual achievement within the African American community during the early 20th century. Emerging against the backdrop of racial segregation and socio-political upheaval, this cultural movement in Harlem, New York, represented a profound awakening of African American identity and creativity. In this comprehensive exploration, we will delve into the rich tapestry of the Harlem Renaissance, examining its historical context, key figures, artistic expressions, social impact, and enduring legacy. To understand the Harlem Renaissance, we must first contextualize it within the broader historical landscape of the early 20th century. The Great Migration was a significant demographic movement of African Americans from the rural southern United States to the urban North, Midwest, and West between the early 20th century and the 1970s. This migration represented one of the largest internal migrations in American history and had profound social, economic, and cultural implications for both African American and American society as a whole. Up until the end of the Civil War, a large population of African Americans were enslaved. During the Reconstruction era, the emancipated African Americans began to strive for civic participation, political equality, and economic and cultural self-determination. Now free, but mostly still living in the South, Blacks still faced harsh discrimination and predatory policies like sharecropping and Jim Crow. Most Southern politicians were former slave owners or proponents of chattel slavery. In the South, African Americans faced harsh segregation, racial violence, and economic exploitation under the Jim Crow laws. Sharecropping, tenant farming, and discriminatory labor practices limited their opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility. Additionally, the boll weevil infestation in southern cotton fields in the early 20th century exacerbated poverty and unemployment among African American agricultural workers. But by the end of World War I, African Americans began to seek out a better life, en masse. Between 1916 and 1970, an estimated 6 million African Americans migrated from the South to urban centers in the North and West in what is known as the Great Migration. Cities such as Chicago, Detroit, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York City experienced dramatic increases in their African American populations, and a 1-mile radius of Upper Manhattan was fertile ground for creativity and innovation, and became a crucible for African American artistic and intellectual expression. Even though the Great Migration brought thousands of Black Americans to New York City, they had already begun setting up enclaves prior to the end of the war. Harlem became an African American neighborhood in the early 1900s. In 1910, a large block along 135th Street and 5th Avenue was bought by various African American realtors and a church group. Many more African Americans arrived during the First World War. Due to the war, the migration of laborers from Europe virtually ceased, while the war effort resulted in a massive demand for unskilled industrial labor. Initially deemed the New Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance began to gather folks' attention through mainstream plays that rejected racist stereotypes. Plays like Granny Mamie and The Writer of Dreams helped combat blackface and minstrel show traditions. Instead, these plays showcased African American actors conveying complex human emotions and yearnings. These early creative outbursts were considered some of the most important events in the entire history of the Negro in the American theater. At the heart of the Harlem Renaissance were the writers and poets who stood at the zenith of flowering of the Negro literature. Their eyes were watching Harlem. Langston Hughes, often hailed as the poet laureate of Harlem, infused his poetry with the rhythms of jazz and blues, exploring themes of identity, pride, and resilience. Zora Neale Hurston, with her keen eye for folklore and dialect, brought the stories and traditions of the rural South to the forefront of American literature. Claude McKay, through his evocative poetry, challenged racial stereotypes and celebrated the beauty and resilience of the African American spirit. Langston Hughes played a pivotal role in shaping the cultural landscape of the era. Through his poetry, essays, and advocacy, Hughes emerged as one of the leading voices of the Harlem Renaissance, capturing the rhythms, struggles, and aspirations of African American life in the early 20th century. Through his work, Hughes celebrated the beauty, resilience, and complexity of African American culture, while challenging prevailing notions of race, identity, and equality. Hughes' poetry served as a powerful expression of the African American experience, capturing the joys, sorrows, and contradictions of life in Harlem and beyond. Hughes' poems, such as The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Brother to Son, and Harlem, Dream Deferred, explored themes of racial pride, social justice, and the quest for freedom, resonating with readers of all backgrounds and generations. One of Hughes' most enduring contributions to the Harlem Renaissance was his championing of the concept of the New Negro, a term coined by Elaine Cook to describe the new generation of African Americans who asserted their pride, dignity, and autonomy in the face of racial oppression. In addition to his literary contributions, Hughes played a key role in promoting the work of other African American writers like Zora Neale and Claude McKay. Zora Neale left an indelible mark on American literature and culture through her vibrant storytelling, key observations, and unapologetic celebration of African American life. She emerged as one of the most important voices of her generation, capturing the richness, complexity, and resilience of African American culture and identity in the early 20th century. Through her novels, short stories, plays, and folklore collections, Hurston helped to redefine the literary landscape of the Harlem Renaissance. One of Hurston's most significant contributions to the Harlem Renaissance was her portrayal of African American life in the rural South, particularly in her native Florida. Drawing on her own experiences growing up in Edenville, Florida, one of the first all-Black towns in the United States, Hurston brought a unique perspective and authenticity to her writing. Her novels, such as Their Eyes Were Watching God and Jonah's Gourd Vine, depicted the struggles, triumphs, and complexities of African American life in the South, exploring themes of love, identity, and self-discovery. In addition to her literary contributions, she was an active participant in the cultural and intellectual life of Harlem and willing collaborator with fellow writers. Hurston's friendships and professional relationships with other Harlem Renaissance figures helped to foster a sense of community and collaboration within the movement, as well as providing support and encouragement to emerging talents. Claude McKay, a Jamaican-born poet, novelist, and essayist, contributed to the movement's vibrant literary and cultural landscape with his powerful works that explored themes of race, identity, and social justice. He became deeply involved in the burgeoning Harlem Renaissance, a period of artistic and intellectual flourishing among African Americans in the 1920s and 1930s. Through his poetry, novels, and essays, McKay challenged prevailing notions of race and identity while advocating for social change and racial equality. One of McKay's most enduring contributions to the Harlem Renaissance was his poem, If We Must Die. Written in response to the racial violence and oppression faced by African Americans, it became a rallying cry for resistance and resilience, urging African Americans to stand up against injustice and oppression. The poem's defiant tone and call to arms resonated with readers, making it one of the most iconic works of the Harlem Renaissance. McKay's novel, Home to Harlem, published in 1928, was one of the first works of fiction to depict the lives of African Americans living in Harlem. The novel explored themes of the Great Migration, identity, and cultural expression, providing readers with a vivid and nuanced portrayal of African American life in the urban North. Home to Harlem became a bestseller and established McKay as a prominent voice in African American literature. The Maestro, the Empress, and the Black Pearl of Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was not confined to the literary sphere. The movement ushered in new styles of music and art. Artists like Aaron Douglas, known for his striking murals and illustrations, captured the vibrancy and dynamism of Harlem life, while also addressing themes of social justice and cultural heritage. Meanwhile, jazz music, with its infectious rhythms and improvisational spirit, became the soundtrack of the Harlem Renaissance, providing a voice for African American experiences and aspirations. Icons such as Duke Ellington, Bessie Smith, and Louis Armstrong helped to popularize jazz and bring it to a global audience, cementing its status as a quintessentially American art form. Considered the maestro of the Harlem Renaissance, Duke Ellington was one of the most influential musicians of the 20th century. Through his innovative compositions, virtuosic performances, and transformative influence on jazz music, he left a permanent mark on the world. Born in Washington, D.C., Ellington rose to prominence during the Harlem Renaissance as the leader of the Duke Ellington Orchestra, one of the most celebrated and influential jazz ensembles of the era. Ellington helped to redefine the sound of jazz, elevate the status of African American musicians, and establish Harlem as a cultural epicenter of American music. Ellington's innovative approach to composition and orchestration pushed the boundaries of jazz music and expanded its artistic possibilities. His compositions, such as Mood Indigo, Take the A Train, and It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, became instant classics and helped to define the sound of the Harlem Renaissance. His use of lush harmonies, intricate arrangements, and innovative instrumentation elevated jazz music to new heights of sophistication and elegance, earning him the nickname The Duke and solidifying his reputation as a musical genius. The Duke Ellington Orchestra helped to popularize jazz music and bring it to a wider audience. The orchestra's residency at Harlem's legendary Cotton Club exposed audiences to the vibrant rhythms and infectious melodies of jazz, while also providing a platform for African American musicians to showcase their talent and creativity. Ellington's charismatic stage presence, dynamic leadership, and virtuosic piano playing captivated audiences and earned him acclaim as one of the greatest band leaders of all time. The maestro also used his platform and influence to promote racial pride, cultural heritage, and artistic excellence within the African American community, challenging prevailing stereotypes and discrimination. One of Ellington's most enduring legacies is his role in shaping the cultural and social landscape of Harlem and the broader African American community. Through his music and activism, Ellington helped to establish Harlem as a cultural epicenter of American music, attracting musicians, artists, and audiences from around the world. From the maestro to the Empress, Bessie Smith, Miss Smith emerged as one of the most influential and iconic figures of the Harlem Renaissance, with her powerful voice, emotive performances, and groundbreaking recordings. She rose from humble beginnings to become one of the highest paid and most celebrated entertainers of her time, earning acclaim for her soulful renditions of blues classics and her fearless embrace of African American identity and expression. Bessie Smith attracted fans from all over the world to Harlem. With her rich, resonant voice and her ability to convey a range of emotions, Smith captivated listeners and earned a reputation as one of the greatest blues singers of all time. Her recordings, such as Downhearted Blues, St. Louis Blues, and Empty Bed Blues, became bestsellers and helped to establish the blues as a mainstream genre of American music, paving the way for future generations of blues artists and performers. Bessie Smith, along with trailblazing performing artists like Josephine Baker, were the reason the effects of the Renaissance stretched across the globe. With her exotic beauty, charismatic personality, and mesmerizing performances, the Black Pearl, Josephine Baker, captivated audiences and shattered racial barriers, becoming one of the first African American women to achieve international fame and success. Her performances at famed venues in Paris, where she danced semi-nude in a banana skirt, scandalized and fascinated audiences, while also challenging notions of racial and sexual propriety. At a time when racial segregation and discrimination were pervasive in American society, Smith and Baker's success as Black women in the entertainment industry was a powerful symbol of resilience, defiance, and achievement. The Apollo. As we touched on earlier, The Harlem Renaissance gained recognition through its stage plays. The performing arts provided a platform for African American actors, singers, and dancers to showcase their talent and creativity. Performers like Paul Robeson captivated audiences with their powerful artistic abilities. But there was one place that was born in Harlem during this time that would go on to birth several generations of African American superstars. Still following along? Make sure you hit that notification bell so you can hear more stories like this one. The Apollo Theater stands as an iconic symbol of African American culture and creativity, serving as a legendary stage that played a pivotal role in shaping the cultural landscape of the Harlem Renaissance. Located in the heart of Harlem, New York City, the Apollo Theater emerged as a vibrant hub of artistic expression, innovation, and community engagement during the 1920s and 1930s, providing a platform for African American performers, artists, and intellectuals to showcase their talents and celebrate their cultural heritage. As one of the premier Black venues for Black entertainers in the United States, the Apollo Theater hosted countless performances by legendary musicians and singers like Billie Holiday and Sarah Vaughan. Performers such as Ethel Waters, Bill Bojangles Robinson, and the Nicholas Brothers dazzled audiences with their talent and creativity, while comedians such as Maz Mabley and Red Fox brought laughter and joy to the stage. The Apollo Theater served as a gathering place for African Americans from all walks of life, providing a space where they could come together to celebrate their culture, share their experiences, and mobilize for social change. The Apollo extended its reach far beyond the zenith of the Harlem Renaissance and cemented itself as a platform for young Black artists. The theater provided opportunities for young African American performers to showcase their talents and pursue their dreams, offering amateur nights and talent showcases that launched the careers of countless artists, including Ella Fitzgerald, James Brown, the Jackson 5, Lauryn Hill, Steve Harvey, and Chris Tucker. An evolution of fashion. One of the greatest shifts in the history of the African American experience came through the dramatic turn in fashion during the Harlem Renaissance. It was a time of great experimentation. Black people sought to express their identity and challenge mainstream fashion trends. Their fashion became a reflection of the changing social and cultural attitudes of the time. Through this, they created new styles that were both innovative and elegant. Women's fashion during the Harlem Renaissance was about a rejection of traditional gender roles. Black women went from the prim and proper, short skirts and silk stockings, to drop-waisted dresses. Women wore loose-fitted garments and accessorized with long-strand pearl bead necklaces, feather boas, and cigarette holders. The fashion of the Harlem Renaissance was used to convey elegance and flamboyancy, and needed to be created with the vibrant dance styles of the 1920s in mind. Men's fashion during the Harlem Renaissance was characterized by a return to elegance and refinement. Men wore tailored suits made from luxurious materials like silk and wool. They accessorized with fedoras and suspenders. This fashion renaissance also introduced the world to the zoot suit, which consisted of wide-legged, high-waisted, peg-top trousers, and a long coat with padded shoulders and wide lapels. Men also wore wide-brimmed hats, colored socks, white gloves, and velvet-collared Chesterfield coats. During this period, African Americans expressed respect for their heritage through a fad for leopard skin coats, indicating the power of the African animal. Harlem Renaissance fashion was all about bold colors, intricate patterns, and attention to detail. The fashion was a celebration of the creativity and innovation of African Americans. It paved the way for future generations of designers and fashion icons like Dapper Dan, Sergio Houston, and Faye Noel. The New Negro. Beyond its artistic achievements, the Harlem Renaissance had profound social and political implications. At its core was the concept of the New Negro, a term coined by Alain Cook and amplified by Langston Hughes to describe a new generation of African Americans who asserted their pride, dignity, and autonomy in the face of racial oppression. World War I created a transformation for African Americans from the old to the new. During the war, Black troops fought abroad to keep the world safe for democracy. They returned home determined to achieve a fuller participation in American society. The philosophy of the civil rights movement shifted from the accommodationist approach to a more militant approach to self-determination. These forces converged to help create the New Negro movement of the 1920s, which promoted a renewed sense of racial pride, cultural self-expression, economic independence, and progressive politics. They carried this new aim as a group with them during the Great Migration, and it flourished in Harlem. Through their art and activism, Harlem Renaissance figures challenged prevailing notions of race and identity, paving the way for the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Harlem would become a hub for contributors to the fight for equality, like Madam C.J. Walker and W.E.B. Du Bois, and later Malcolm X. The Harlem Renaissance also served as a catalyst for broader cultural and intellectual movements, inspiring subsequent generations of artists, writers, and activists to continue the fight for social justice and equality. Legacy of the Renaissance. The legacy of the Harlem Renaissance endures to this day, leaving an indelible mark on American culture and society. Its influence can be seen in the work of contemporary artists, writers, and musicians who draw inspiration from the creativity and resilience of their predecessors. The Harlem Renaissance also serves as a reminder of the power of art and culture to affect social change and foster understanding across racial and cultural divides. As we reflect on the achievements of the Harlem Renaissance, we are reminded of the enduring spirit of resilience, creativity, and hope that continues to shape the African American experience and enrich the cultural fabric of our nation. Its influence can still be seen today in fashion, music, and Black pride, as African Americans look to the past for inspiration and how to go forward. The Harlem Renaissance represents a pivotal moment in American history, making a cultural renaissance and a celebration of African American identity and creativity. Against the backdrop of racial segregation and social injustice, Harlem became a beacon of hope and inspiration, giving rise to a generation of artists, writers, and thinkers who defied the odds and left an indelible mark on American culture. As we honor the achievements of the Harlem Renaissance, let us also reflect on its enduring legacy and the ongoing struggle for equality and justice in our society.